Just less than 2.5 million years ago, in the early Pleistocene epoch of Eastern Africa, a group of hairy bipedal apes evolved, and soon after began to use basic stone tools. They didn't know it, but they were the first species of a new genus that would one day transform the world beyond recognition. This was Homo habilis, the very first species of true human under the genus name Homo, the full binomial name translating to handyman. For almost 1 million years, these apes would live in social colonies across the plains and savannahs of eastern and southern Africa, and were our earliest human ancestors. Life wasn't easy for them, though. The plains of prehistoric Africa were wild, filled with danger, and life was often short and perilous. Homo habilis persisted, however, and a group of individuals would one day split from the species, stepping one pace closer on the path to you and me. Today, we will be taking a look at how these strange early apes lived, how they evolved, how they were built, where they lived, and ultimately how they died. Welcome to our documentary on Homo habilis, the very first species of human. If you were to take a Homo habilis individual 2.5 million years in the future to the present day, put him in a suit and have him walk down the street, he would turn a few heads. The same might not be said for some of the later human species, but Homo habilis was very clearly the first step on the human line, and was very much an early prototype to the path that would one day lead to Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo denisova, the 3 species of human that made up the late Pleistocene Ice Age. No, Homo habilis lived much earlier, and their kind was still endemic to Africa's plains and savannahs. An adult male Homo habilis may have grown up to around 5 feet tall, smaller than the average height of the modern day. They were most likely very hairy, as the genus of ape that predated them, Australopithecus, were much more similar to that classic ape form than to what we think of as a modern human, and there were many shared facial characteristics between the two creatures. The arms of these early humans were still long and were still well adapted to climbing and swinging through trees to escape danger. These apes may have left the safety of the trees for the rewards of the bountiful grasslands, but they were still in danger from many different species of wild animal and needed to be cautious. Therefore, a quick escape back to the branches was often necessary. Homo habilis likely spent the vast majority of its time walking upright, and was even capable of breaking into a speedy run for much longer periods of time than its predecessors. It's likely that Homo habilis's legs, therefore, were much longer than any previous species of ape, and groups of these species likely traveled relatively long distances across the African savannas in search of food or new territories to claim. It is ultimately Homo habilis's face that would have set our individual apart from the crowd when walking down a modern street. He would have still possessed many primitive human features that were yet to develop to look like you and me. The cranial capacity of Homo habilis was less than half of that found in modern humans, resulting in a much narrower forehead, higher set eyes, and a smaller, more ape-like back of the skull. The nose was much flatter than a modern human's, and the nostrils were large and forward-facing. Homo habilis's mouth protruded forward more too, obviously betraying its ape ancestry. Altogether, this was a very different species of ape to the ones that had existed previously. But it wasn't an easy path to get to where they were at this point. As we're about to find out, Homo habilis' ancestors likely found life even more difficult. As we mentioned in the previous section, Homo habilis, the first species in the genus Homo, evolved from a genus of bipedal, upright walking ape named Australopithecus, or southern ape when translated to English. Australopithecus accentuated the ape-like features prominent in Homo habilis, most notably in the face again. It was likely hairier. Its mouth protruded even further. The brain case was smaller still, and it was highly adapted to life in the trees. Australopithecus was the first ape to walk upright for extended periods of time, and in evolving towards Homo habilis and its future kin, it would focus more and more on abandoning the trees, adapting entirely to life on the ground. The most likely candidates for the Australopithecus species that led to the Homo habilis include the famous Australopithecus afarensis, or the lesser-known Australopithecus sediba, which started to die out just under 3 million years ago, when one branch of one of these species would begin to lead to our Homo habilis. As scientists have found, it is extremely hard to pinpoint exactly when the Australopithecus genus gave rise to the Homo one. And prior to Homo habilis' 1964 discovery by Louis Leakey, Philip Tobias, and John Napier, it was assumed that it was Homo erectus, a later species that was the next stop along. This seemed like a big jump, as erectus was a much more obvious change straight from the Australopithecus genuses. As such, it became obvious that another piece of the puzzle had then been completed. But what caused one of the Australopithecus species to evolve into Homo habilis? This is a question that has been the subject of debate over the years since Homo habilis' discovery. But it may have something to do with food sources, or the environments in which the apes lived. Perhaps the trees, which Australopithecus and its ancestors relied on, became more sparse, causing them to descend from the trees and become more adapted to walking upright. Perhaps some species adapted to feed on different foods. Many species of early upright ape held omnivorous diets, adapted to eating plant matter and meat, which may have been more readily available on the ground. Although Homo habilis was officially announced and described as a new species in 1964, the first evidence for its existence was unearthed in the Olduvai Gorge, a significant paleoarchaeological site in Tanzania, when 2 fossilized teeth were unearthed in a region led by Mary and Louis Leakey from Britain. These teeth were from an adult ape, uncannily similar to a modern human being. And as time went on, the Olduvai Gorge would prove to be more and more fruitful as a location for unearthing fossils from this new species. The following year, a partial skeleton was discovered in the gorge, belonging to a young Homo habilis male. And from there, successful expeditions became commonplace. Today, we have a good understanding of Homo habilis' anatomy, which we have managed to discern from a number of different fossils. These include teeth, entire skulls, lower jaws, lower leg bones, bones from the foot, and several partially complete skeletons. The bones of Homo habilis tell us an awful lot about how these creatures may have lived, adapted, and interacted with their dynamic Pleistocene environment. The bones of the hand tell us that these apes would have been able to close a precision grip around an object, for example. This was due to developments in the brain, which allowed these creatures to develop the ability to produce basic stone tools, but we'll go into detail on that more later on in the video. It was the length of the legs and arms, when contrasted against one another, that tell us that, while this was a creature who could readily walk upright, it was still at home in the safety of the trees. This, combined with the shape of their jaw and skull, tell us that they were more closely related to Australopithecines than we first thought. The teeth, in particular, showed evidence of creatures that were well on their way to evolving into animals that resembled us. Their teeth were very much like ours, with the exception of the incisors. These were still relatively long and sharp, similar to those of a chimpanzee or gorilla. Most significant of all was the brain case of Homo habilis. As the brain expanded, so did the skull, and the 600 or so cubic centimeters of brain in these apes caused the skull to bulb out and become more rounded in the process. The brain made up a total of 1.7% of Homo habilis' body weight, a significant statistic when compared with the apes it evolved from. Homo habilis was a significant discovery. This was plainly a creature more advanced than the Australopithecine apes it succeeded, but was too primitive to be considered a member of the later species. Unsurprisingly, Homo habilis would go on to become a very controversial species, and some scientists debate its existence at all, claiming that it was synonymous with Homo rudolfensis, a creature with which it shared the open plains of Tanzania. Firstly, it is important to note that Homo habilis is believed to have been one of the first users of early stone tools in the Homo genus. Although the Australopithecines, the more primitive species we met earlier, were using the most basic of tools to crack open food items prior to the evolution of Homo habilis, our Homo ancestors took it to a new level entirely that would lay the foundations for the basics of future machinery and tool use. Homo habilis is most closely associated with the use of a stone tool industry known as the Oldowan, a prehistoric grouping of tools identified by their simple nature and sharp edges that were used to skin and butcher animals or to break into their tough carcasses. The Oldowan industry tools share various similar features. They are rounded at one end and sharpened at the other, but lack any extensive evidence of design or production. Oldowan tools were made by a Homo habilis individual, gripping a stone in each hand, swiping them together to force chips of stone to flake off of the intended tool, sharpening it in the process. The Oldowan tool industry and the specific names of the tool specimens recovered are derived from Tanzania's Olduvai Gorge, a key site known for harboring the remains of Homo habilis individuals. Mary Leakey, an accomplished British paleoanthropologist who lived from 1913 to 1996, was responsible for the area's discovery and naming, and some of the stone tools recovered at the gorge show sufficient evidence that some of these primitive men and women knew what they were doing. The Oldowan tools were just that, tools, specifically intended for their desired purpose, which shows a great leap forward in intelligence for these prehistoric apes. The evidence of flaking and chipping on the stones in Olduvai Gorge allow us to discern that the Homo habilis that made them knew what they were doing with the tools. They were more well-formed and advanced than the basic stone equipment made by the Australopithecines that preceded them, and we know that, from the tool's existence, that these individuals knew how to hit the stones together at exactly the right spots in order to make them flake off into a sharp point. This would have taken a comparatively high degree of intelligence, and thus far, at the time of their arrival in the world, Homo habilis were the most intelligent animals that have evolved yet. A new dawn was truly starting for not just the animal kingdom, but for the world. What we can tell, however, is that very little creative design went into constructing the Oldowan tools. There is no evidence that, with their slicing and cutting tools, Homo habilis were able to construct anything more advanced than a simple proto-bit face, an extremely early form of knife that would one day evolve with its creator to turn into a deadly spear tip or a sharp slicing knife. This tells us that Homo habilis was unlikely to have been a hunter. We know from the general structure and build of the animal's body and teeth that these early people were supplementing their vegetarian diet with helpings of meat, but they would have had very little means of obtaining much of it without the help of the local area's predators. It is, of course, entirely possible that unlucky or unwary small animals, or eggs, could have been caught with their grasping hands, equipped with powerful opposable thumbs, but they lack the capability to bring down bigger prey, such as antelope or other ungulates, equipped only with a simple stone cutting tool. Therefore, it is sensible to assume that the majority of meat in Homo habilis' diet came from the carcasses that had already been brought down by other carnivores. Like the vultures they shared the early Pleistocene plains with, they were scavengers. Still, the fact that these tools exist at all imply that Homo habilis has some form of understanding of simple mechanics in one way or another. It's surely a strange and even eerie thing to picture the big cats of the African savannah retreating away from a fallen antelope after eating their fill, only to be cautiously shadowed by a family of skulking Homo habilis, a creature so close and yet so far towards the path to Homo sapiens, clutching their stone-cutting tools and grunting to each other with their underdeveloped vocal cords, the same basic vocal noises that would one day lead to me presenting this very video you're watching. However, there is something else. In 1962, 2 years before Homo habilis was discovered, a strange circle of volcanic stones, over 4 meters long by 3 meters wide, was discovered in the Olduvai Gorge. These stones were firmly planted into the ground, between spaces of just over half a meter and at about 30 centimeters in height. This was certainly man-made. No other species known to science at the time could have put together such a structure, evenly spacing particular stones. Mary Leakey's theory on this structure is that some sort of early hominid used these rocks to support a pole or support of some kind, possibly to create the most basic of primitive shelters or windbreaks, to guard the creatures from the pouring rain or blistering heat of Tanzania's savannahs. These stones are the oldest known form of architecture known to man, and, although basic, laid the foundations for the mighty skyscrapers, monuments, and other structures of the modern day. It is, to this day, unknown which specific species of early human made this structure, but due to the age of the rocks and the location it was discovered, it has often been associated with Homo habilis. One other important point to make about Homo habilis' lifestyle and behavior is the potential practice of monogamy. They may have even been the first human species to do this. Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, two species which succeeded Homo habilis, are known to have mated for life, or to have had one partner at a given time, but it is speculated that this practice may have begun with their habilis predecessors. The communal structure that Homo habilis lived in has been previously compared to that of baboons, where multiple males coexist in a group with multiple females. Some of these groups may have numbered anywhere up to 80 individuals at one time. The males banded together to defend the troop from rivals or attackers, which may have involved Homo habilis individuals raising their arms, throwing sticks or stones, and repeatedly screeching at predators or rivals to intimidate them and scare them off. If it didn't work, Homo habilis would retreat to the relative safety of the trees, using their still elongated arms to grasp branches that would otherwise be hard to reach. The open savannas were a new and dangerous habitat for these apes, and danger could have been lurking behind any tree, rock, or grass patch. The savannas of Africa in the early Pleistocene were not too dissimilar in terms of the landscape and biome as the savanna grasslands of Tanzania today. Tall grasses, yellowish-green in color, would have spread out successfully across the dramatic open landscape, disturbed only by the odd patch of trees or rocks. Denser forests would have existed on the fringes of these mighty plains, and rivers would have still cut through the land, providing a vital water source for these early men. But as time went on, the Homo genus were becoming less and less adapted to a life in the trees. Their brains were growing. They were learning to walk and run permanently on their own 2 feet, and they were adapting to food sources that thrived in the great savannas of Africa. Nature was forcing them toward the plains, but they were by no means the only creatures out there. In fact, Homo habilis wouldn't even be the only species of hominid out on the savannas. 4 other species of hominid, 3 of which belong to the genus Homo, would occupy the savannas of Tanzania at the same time as our Homo habilis. And this was just the first time throughout prehistory that this would happen. Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, and Homo rudolfensis would be present throughout the time of habilis. But these are all creatures that we will be covering in further detail on this channel going forward. Ergaster and erectus specifically were species that succeeded habilis on these plains, and are in fact more closely related to you and I than their relatively primitive cousins. There was another creature that Homo habilis would have encountered on the plains, one uncannily familiar to its Australopithecus relatives, Paranthropus boisei. Sometimes, this creature is even referred to as Australopithecus boisei, due to the extreme similarities between the genuses, and are likely to have inhabited wooded wetlands or forests closer to the fringes of the savanna. Bulky, hairy, and bipedal, like the Australopithecus the habilises evolved from, it was definitely plausible that groups of Paranthropus boisei could have encountered large troops of Homo habilis as they wandered close to the fringes of each other's territories. What did they think when they met? Did they recognize each other as relatives, perhaps? Or did they just acknowledge them and slink away into the woods? We may never know. So where did the Homo habilis get the meat it relied upon for its balanced omnivorous diet? That answer can be found in the corpses of antelopes and horses, similar to the zebras and gazelles that populate the plains in vast herds today. These medium-sized ungulates would have been brought down by larger predators for the hominids and vultures to scavenge from later. But it is feasible to assume that all manner of creatures provided meat for these apes. Any large animal that fell or passed on the savanna could have been picked from. Perhaps Homo habilis consumed turtles or fish from the rivers when they could catch them, or caught small rodents or birds' eggs from the ground or up in the trees. Although Homo habilis was taking the first steps towards conquering the grasslands, it was by no means at the top of its ecosystem. Individuals that strayed too far from the group, youngsters, or the old and wounded, would have needed to be extra cautious when doing just about anything in Pleistocene Tanzania, for there were numerous threats waiting to claim an unwary early hominid. Australopithecus experienced it, and so did Homo habilis. Active predation from larger creatures. The savannahs were plentiful with large carnivorous cats. Leopards, for example, similar to the ones alive today, would have been able to climb trees and pick off an unwary hominid, as well as stalking them on the ground in silence. Two extinct genuses of large cat were present on these plains too: Dinofelis and Megantereon, a deadly duo of saber-toothed cats. Megantereon in particular persisted through to the Middle Pleistocene, where it continued to pose a deadly threat to Homo erectus when they took over the savannahs. It wasn't even just the cats that Homo habilis needed to be wary of. Africa at the time was populated by another extinct mammalian predator that would have stormed the plains in groups: the hunting hyena. Several species from the genus Chasmoporthetes were present in Africa at the time our ancestors were making their first upright steps. These hyenas ran on long, slender legs, similar to those of modern-day cheetahs, and likely pursued fast-moving prey across the grasslands. Our relatives would have been an easy catch, as they brought their quarries down with knife-like teeth. Homo habilis wasn't even safe when it needed to take a drink at the local rivers or lakes. Crocodiles were abundant in these areas, and it would only take a moment of carelessness to kneel down and drink, only to be met with the gaping jaws of a large carnivorous reptile, pulling an unwary ape down into the muddy waters. One Homo habilis fossil even shows an attack from a crocodile. The front half of the foot had been consumed or torn off by the reptile, which on the Pleistocene plains of Tanzania would have been a death sentence for a Homo habilis. It's hard to provide confident, accurate reasoning for the ultimate demise of Homo habilis. It is likely that, over the course of the Pleistocene, numerous factors contributed to the downfall of this early species. But one theory, from Dr. Pascal Raya, from the Università di Napoli Federico II in Italy, may have a very credible answer, published in the journal One Earth in 2020. Through looking at an advanced form of past climate emulator, Raya and colleagues were able to keep track of rainfall, temperature, and general climate over the Pliocene and Pleistocene epochs. And from their results, it looks like later Homo species were beginning to lose access to their climatic niches across the world due to the sharp and rapid changes of climate across the globe. Environments that these early men and women relied upon began to disappear, and as a result, so did their food sources. Perhaps the same could be said for Homo habilis. Or perhaps this was just one factor in a plethora of others. It is also important to remember that Homo habilis coexisted with 3 other species of Homo throughout the time it was extant on Earth. Particularly, Homo ergaster and Homo erectus were more intelligent than the comparatively primitive habilis. So perhaps our apes were simply outcompeted by creatures that were better adapted to living and hunting in social groups across the plains of Tanzania. Whatever happened to the Homo habilis populations of Tanzania in the early Pleistocene, the Homo genus's legacy does not end here. This was just the beginning of a story that spans over 1 million years. A story that would culminate in this very moment in time. Other Homo species would persist, but it is Homo habilis that laid the foundations for them to do so. To you and I, they truly deserve their translated name, handyman. Our ancestors' early beginnings may have been a far cry from the complexities and luxuries of the present day, but Homo habilis at the advent of its evolution, was the most intelligent creature the planet had seen to date. The notion of a creature learning to change the shape of its environment to such an extent was unheard of in the fossil record prior to this. If it was indeed Homo habilis that made the primitive stone shelter in the Olduvai Gorge over 1 million years ago, then this revolutionizes our understanding of these early creatures, the way they lived and the way their minds worked. We have a long way to go on our story before we reach the evolution of Homo sapiens. But it is important not to underestimate the significance of habilis as the forefathers of mechanics and technology. It is in partial thanks to these early hominids that you are even able to watch this video today. Thank you for watching. We hope you have enjoyed this brief journey to our ancestors' pasts, and we hope you'll stick around to see what we have planned for the future of this channel.